Raphael stared at the exam paper like it had personally betrayed him. The room was quiet except for the scratch of pens and the soft shuffle of chairs. But inside his head, there was nothing. No formulas, no definitions, no neat little facts he had spent nights trying to memorize. Just a blank, bright void. He blinked hard, took a breath, and felt that familiar wave of panic rise up from his stomach to his chest. It was the same feeling he got in meetings at work when someone asked him a question he knew he'd heard before, or when he bumped into an old acquaintance and their name vanished the second they smiled at him. Later, walking home, he'd mutter the same thing to himself. My memory's terrible. Maybe you've said that too. Most of us have, usually with a mix of embarrassment and frustration, as if our brain has let us down at the worst possible moment. But what if the problem isn't that your memory is broken? What if your brain is actually doing exactly what it was built to do? That's the part Raphael didn't understand. He thought memory worked like a storage unit. Put information in, shut the door, and trust it'll still be there when you come back. Clean, simple, reliable. But the human brain isn't a filing cabinet. It's more like a living filter, constantly deciding what matters, what can wait, and what's safe to drop. In other words, forgetting isn't always failure. Often, it's efficiency, and that changes everything. Because if you've ever studied for hours, read the same page 3 times, or left a conversation convinced you were paying attention and still walked away with nothing, you're not alone. The brain doesn't treat all information equally. It first has to notice it, then code it properly, then keep it accessible later. And if any one of those steps slips, the whole thing can feel like your mind has gone blank. That's why so many people get stuck blaming themselves. They think, I'm just not good with names, or I've always had a bad memory. But the truth is more interesting than that, and a lot more useful. Once you understand how memory actually works, you stop fighting your brain like it's the enemy, and start learning how to work with it instead. So let's unpack what's really going on inside your head, because the first clue is this. Remembering isn't a single event. It's a process. And right at the start and right at the end, that's where most people trip up. Raphael sat in a library with his elbows on the desk, staring at a page he'd already read 3 times. The words were there, but they weren't staying. He rubbed his face and muttered, half to himself, I'm just not good at this. My memory's rubbish. It was the kind of sentence so many people say without thinking, especially when life gets busy and the brain seems to betray you at the worst possible moment. But the truth is, memory doesn't work like a cupboard where you neatly store every fact and pull out later on command. It's more like a busy security gate. The brain is constantly deciding what deserves attention, what gets a label, and what gets pushed aside. Most of the time, forgetting is not failure. It's sorting. It's the brain saying, this doesn't look important enough to keep. That's why memory has 3 big steps: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is when information first gets in. Storage is what happens when the brain keeps it around. Retrieval is the moment you try to get it back. And if you think about it, the weak spots are usually right at the start and right at the end. If you never properly encoded the information in the first place, there's nothing solid to store. And if you can't retrieve it under pressure, it can feel like it disappeared completely, even when it's still somewhere in there. Raphael could feel that in his own life. He'd read notes late at night, tired and distracted, then wonder why his mind went blank the next day. The problem wasn't that he had a bad memory. The problem was that his brain had never been given a reason to tag that information as worth keeping. And rereading, as comforting as it feels, often tricks us into thinking we know more than we do. Your eyes move over the page. The sentence looks familiar, and you feel productive. But familiarity is not the same as recall. That's where smarter methods come in. Active recall forces the brain to work, to pull information out rather than just letting it wash over you. Spaced repetition gives memory time to strengthen, instead of cramming everything into one exhausted session. And the old method of loci, or memory palace, turns abstract facts into vivid places your mind can walk through. Strange as it sounds, the brain remembers images, locations, and movement far better than dry text. Raphael looked up from his notes, a little less defeated now. Maybe the issue was never that his brain was broken. Maybe he'd just been asking it to learn in the wrong way. And once you see memory for what it really is, everything starts to change. By the time Raphael stepped out of the lecture hall, the panic had eased a little, but the lesson had landed hard. His brain hadn't betrayed him. It had simply done what brains do. It had decided, sometimes very quickly, that certain things were worth keeping and others weren't. And once you understand that, the whole idea of having a bad memory starts to look a lot less personal and a lot more practical. That's the real turning point, isn't it? Because forgetting isn't proof that you're careless, lazy, or getting worse. In many cases, it's just a sign that information never got properly encoded in the first place, or that it was stored in a way that made it hard to find again later. The good news is that this means memory can be trained. Not magically, not overnight, but definitely improved with the right habits. Raphael began testing it for himself in the most ordinary places. Before class, he stopped rereading his notes in a daze and started quizzing himself instead. He covered the page, looked away from the screen, and forced his mind to reach. At first it felt slower and more uncomfortable, but that discomfort was the point. He was teaching his brain that the information mattered. Then he stretched the practice over days, not hours, bringing the same ideas back just as they were beginning to fade. Spaced repetition made the material stick in a way a late-night cram session never could. And the memory palace? That was the one that surprised him most. He pictured his own home and placed ideas in vivid, absurd spots. A tax law on the kitchen bench, a psychology term hanging from the hallway light, a lecture concept sitting on the sofa wearing his father's old glasses. The more strange and visual it became, the easier it was to remember. It felt almost silly until it worked. So if your mind blanks out now and then, don't rush to call it a flaw. Your brain is not a broken machine. It's a living system, constantly deciding what deserves your attention. The trick is learning how to speak its language. And maybe that's the question to leave you with. What important thing have you been trying to remember the hard way, when your brain was waiting for a better one? If this gave you a new way to think about memory, give it a quiet like. And if you want more science that actually makes everyday life easier, you might want to stick around for the next one.